setting out special grand opening bargains everywhere you look.
Kool-Aid!
Kids love my super fruity flavors.
Instant Quaker oatmeal. Sniffer cake turd.
Do you remember those no-frills brands? The ones you bought when money was tight and there was no room for anything else? In the 1970s, these products filled cupboards and dinner plates in homes doing their best to get by. Looking back now, was it really just about saving or about surviving with pride? It came in that iconic blue box with a tiny foil packet of cheese powder. And if you grew up poor in the 1970s, you probably had it more than you care to admit. Kraft macaroni and cheese was fast, cheap, and filling, and that was the whole point. You boiled the elbows, drained them, stirred in milk, butter, and that orange dust, and somehow it turned into dinner. Not fancy, not special, just enough. It was a lifesaver for single moms, tired dads, and babysitters who needed to get something in front of a hungry kid in 5 minutes. The cheese was salty, smooth, and tasted like comfort, even if you knew it came out of a packet. Some families dressed it up with canned peas or cut-up hot dogs. Others just served it straight and called it a meal. You would see that blue box stacked high in grocery carts when money was tight. It was the kind of thing you bought 5 at a time because it would get you through the week. Nobody bragged about it, but everybody ate it. And for poor families in the 1970s, Kraft macaroni and cheese was not just food. It was a little relief in a boiling pot of water. It filled empty bellies and bought time until the next paycheck. And sometimes, that was more than enough. You tore open the paper pouch, poured the white dust into a pitcher, added water, and hoped it would taste even close to the real thing. Carnation powdered milk was a staple in low-income homes during the 1970s, not because anyone loved it, but because it lasted forever and cost less. Fresh milk spoiled fast and hit the budget harder. This stuff, it sat on the shelf until you needed it. It was chalky, it was thin, and if you mixed it wrong, it clumped like paint. But when you were broke, it was milk or close enough. You poured it on cereal, stirred it into mashed potatoes, and used it in baking like it was the real deal. Sometimes parents would stretch a small amount of real milk by mixing it with Carnation, hoping no one noticed. Kids did notice, but they drank it anyway, because there was nothing else. Carnation powdered milk was survival in a paper box. It was the kind of thing you bought with food stamps or picked up from food pantries. It did not taste like much, but it meant there would be breakfast tomorrow. And even if it left a strange aftertaste, it also left just enough room in the grocery budget to make it through the week. It cost about a nickel, and it made 2 quarts of color and sugar that kept kids from complaining. Kool-Aid was the poor man's soft drink in the 1970s, bright, sweet, and aggressively artificial. But when you had 5 kids and no soda money, it was a blessing in a little paper packet. You poured it into a plastic pitcher, added water and way too much sugar, stirred it until your arm hurt, and served it in jelly jars or reused margarine tubs. Grape, cherry, orange, blue. Nobody really cared about the flavor. It was cold, sweet, and felt like a treat. Parents liked it because it was cheap. Kids liked it because it looked like something better. And somehow, it always lasted just long enough to make it through dinner. Kool-Aid was more than a drink. It was an easy win, something bright and fun when everything else on the table felt dull and beige. Some families froze it into popsicles or packed it into lunch thermoses. Others just kept a pitcher in the fridge like it was sacred. It stained your tongue and your fingers. It left a sugary ring around every cup, but it also made summer afternoons and broke down dinners feel like something worth remembering. It came in a squat metal can with a red label and a smiling cartoon chef, and if you were poor in the 1970s, it probably fed you more times than you could count. Chef Boyardee spaghetti was cheap, filling, and easy enough for a kid to make. You popped the lid, dumped it into a pot or a bowl, heated it until it bubbled, and called it a hot meal. The noodles were soft, the sauce was sweet, the meat was there, somewhere. But it was dinner, and when money was low, that was more than good enough. Some families ate it straight from the can when they could not afford electricity or gas. Others stretched it with toast, crackers, or the last slice of American cheese. It was the kind of food that got you through a hard day and maybe the next one too. Chef Boyardee was not about flavor. It was about function. It fed kids when there was no one to cook. It kept stomachs from growling at school. It sat in the cupboard as a quiet backup plan. Always waiting, always there. It might not have been anyone's favorite, but it earned its place on the shelf. It came in a massive plastic bag, usually near the floor of the cereal aisle, and it had a name you barely recognized. No-frills cereal was the budget version of everything you wanted. Cornflakes, fruit rings, puffed rice, all just slightly off from the real thing. But when the name brand box cost twice as much, this was what you got. It did not come with a prize. The mascots were generic, and the bag was hard to store without spilling, but it poured into the bowl just fine. Add a splash of powdered milk and a spoon, and that was breakfast. The taste was close enough. Close enough to fool a sleepy kid. Close enough to keep you from feeling like you were missing out. And honestly, close enough to stretch the grocery budget another week. Poor families in the 1970s lived on this stuff. It was part of morning routines and late-night snacks. You ate it dry as a snack or mixed into homemade trail mix when lunchboxes needed a filler. No-frills cereal was not glamorous. It was practical. And for kids growing up with less, it was proof that something simple could still feel like something good. The jar was plastic. The lid was red. And the label had a happy, kid-friendly vibe that made it feel like a treat. But Peter Pan peanut butter was also one of the most affordable brands on the shelf in the 1970s, and that is why it ended up in so many low-income homes. It was creamy, sweet, and spread easily, even when the bread was stale or the knife was dull. You made sandwiches with it. You ate it off a spoon. You dipped apples if you had them, crackers if you did not. It worked for breakfast, lunch, snacks, and sometimes even dinner. A spoonful of peanut butter could quiet hunger, give you a little energy, and stretch a day until bedtime. It lasted longer than most groceries and kept longer too. Peter Pan was not fancy, but it was dependable. It showed up in school lunches, in food pantry bags, in packed suitcases for road trips. It was the peanut butter of survival and simple comfort. It did not need to be organic or gourmet. It just needed to be there. And it always was. They came in a paper-thin box and cost less than $1. Banquet frozen pot pies were one of the few hot meals you could buy on a shoestring budget in the 1970s. You pulled it from the freezer, peeled back the foil top, and waited while the oven did its slow, uneven magic. The crust burned around the edges. The filling stayed frozen in the middle. But when it finally cooked through, it felt like a real dinner. A little meat, a little gravy, a few peas and carrots. What more did you need? For poor families, it was about the feeling, sitting down with a hot plate and a knife and fork, pretending, even just a little, that things were normal, that this was how dinner was supposed to be. Banquet pot pies were not luxurious, but they were warm. They were something to look forward to on cold nights and end-of-month paychecks. You served them with canned corn or instant potatoes or nothing at all, and it was not perfect, but it was food. And when you did not have much, that counted for everything. You found it in the cold section, wrapped in shiny foil with a little crown on the label. Imperial Margarine was the butter substitute you bought when butter was a luxury. It was soft, yellow, and always in the fridge. You used it for toast, for baking, for cooking, for spreading on saltines when there was not much else to eat. It was cheap and lasted forever. You could taste the difference, but that was not the point. Poor families in the 1970s used margarine for everything. It made dry bread bearable and instant potatoes creamy. You melted it over rice, stirred it into canned vegetables, and added it to boxed mixes. It was never about indulgence. It was about necessity. Imperial Margarine helped stretch groceries and make the most of every meal. The flavor was bland, but dependable. The texture was smooth, even after weeks in the fridge. And if you were lucky, you got the tub version, which doubled as a container once it was empty. Imperial was not butter. But it was always there, and sometimes that was more important. You did not buy name-brand cola unless there was a coupon or a sale. You bought Shasta. It came in tall silver cans with loud colors and louder flavors: cola, root beer, orange, grape, and it cost less than half of the big brands. For poor families in the 1970s, Shasta was the party drink, the movie night treat, the after-dinner splash of sweetness. It fizzed like the real thing, even if the taste was a little off. Kids did not care. Adults shrugged and drank it anyway. Shasta made you feel like you had something extra, like you could afford a little fun without breaking the budget. You brought it to potlucks, poured it into Dixie cups, packed it into coolers for summer barbecues. The cans always seemed colder. The flavors always seemed brighter. Maybe it was just because you appreciated it more when money was tight. Shasta was not a luxury. It was a substitute. But it was a good one. And it meant you did not have to say no when someone asked for a soda. It came in a small blue box, cost a handful of change, and turned a quiet meal into something that felt like comfort. Jiffy corn muffin mix was a pantry hero in poor households during the 1970s. Just add milk and an egg if you had one, and you had hot muffins in the oven in under 20 minutes. They were sweet, soft, and a little crumbly. You ate them with beans, stew, soup, or just plain with margarine. Some families made them stretch by adding canned corn. Others just served them as is and let the warmth do the talking. Jiffy was cheap, easy, and always there. A side dish that felt like something more. Like someone had tried. Like dinner meant more than just filling up. The box was small, but the impact was big. Jiffy helped turn a dollar store dinner into something that felt like home. It was soft enough to squish flat in your hands, and if you folded it just right, it turned into a doughy ball. Wonderbread was not fancy. It was white, sweet, and stripped of anything remotely whole grain. But in poor homes in the 1970s, it was lunch, it was breakfast, and sometimes it was dinner. You slapped peanut butter on it, fried bologna, mayonnaise and tomato, sugar and butter when nothing else was left. It tore easily, went stale quickly, and stuck to the roof of your mouth. But it was always there. It was the bread that filled bellies without asking much in return. You never thought about fiber or nutrition. You thought about having enough. It was soft enough for babies and cheap enough for everyone. The bag had that bright red, yellow, and blue polka dot pattern that made it feel more cheerful than it had any right to be. It cost less than other brands but felt like a name you could trust. You packed it in school lunches, served it with canned soup, or toasted it when you needed something hot. Wonderbread was not about flavor or nutrition. It was about getting through the day, feeding a family on $5 and making it stretch to Friday. It was a loaf that went with everything and judged nothing. And in a house where the grocery budget was more calculator than craving, that soft white bread meant you had something to lean on, something dependable, slice after slice. They came in dull silver cans with paper labels that barely held on, and a price tag you could actually afford. Piggly Wiggly brand canned vegetables were basic, bland, and absolutely essential in poor households in the 1970s. Peas, corn, green beans, they were all about the same. Software mushy, but they counted. You dumped them into a pot with a little water and margarine and let them heat while the main dish stretched as far as it could. They were not crisp. They were not fresh, but they filled half the plate and made everything else look a little more complete. These cans were never about taste. They were about showing up. You could buy 5 or 6 without blowing your whole budget. They made the plate look full, and that was half the battle. Piggly Wiggly was the store where price mattered more than packaging. Store-brand cans lined the shelves, and smart families grabbed them by the armload. If you had to feed 6 people and could only afford a few bucks worth of sides, this was your aisle. Sometimes you threw them in casseroles, other times you ate them straight. Either way, they were warm, salty, and made the meal feel less like survival and more like supper. They were not glamorous, but they were always there when it mattered. And for anyone trying to stretch every dollar in every dish, that meant everything. You peeled back the lid with that little curl of metal and tried not to spill the oil. Store-brand tuna and oil was a cheap protein that showed up again and again in poor families' kitchens during the 1970s. It was fish. It was affordable. And it made a can of something feel like an actual meal. It had a strong smell, and the oil always made a mess. But you mixed it with mayonnaise, spooned it onto crackers, stirred it into pasta, or stuffed it into white bread sandwiches. Sometimes it stretched far enough to feed 3 people. Other times you ate it right from the can. You did not buy tuna because it was delicious. You bought it because it filled the gap. It was the kind of food that kept you going when the fridge was empty. It might not have tasted great, but it got the job done. It was shelf-stable, long-lasting, and cheap enough to buy in bulk when it was on sale. You did not buy the brand name stuff unless you had a coupon. But the store brand worked just fine. It was not about gourmet. It was about getting by. And in a world where protein was expensive and time was tight, canned tuna in oil got the job done. You might not have liked it, but you learned to appreciate it. And if you grew up on it, the taste is probably still buried somewhere in your memory. You pulled it from the freezer, peeled back the foil, and popped it into the oven with a prayer that the brownie would not burn before the peas unfroze. TV brand frozen dinners were cheap, filling, and about as close as poor families got to restaurant food in the 1970s. The compartments kept everything separate: the meat, the mashed potatoes, the tiny dessert, Salisbury steak, fried chicken, turkey, and stuffing. The meals all sort of tasted the same, but they looked like more than they were. They made you feel like you were eating something fancy, even if it came in a tin tray. You had your own meal, your own dessert, your own little moment. It was dinner and dignity baked into one. Kids felt grown up eating them. Parents liked the price. You could buy a stack of them and have dinner for the week. They were hot, required no prep, and made it easy to say yes when everyone was too tired to cook. They were not about health. They were about convenience. You slid them out of the oven, ate them in front of the television, and called it a night. It was a little luxury for families who rarely got one, and for a few quiet minutes it felt like more than just a frozen tray. It felt like a break. RC Cola was the third-string soda, the one you reached for when Coca-Cola and Pepsi were just out of reach. But in the 1970s, if you were poor, RC Cola was more than enough. It came in tall glass bottles or big cans with bold blue and red branding, and it fizzed just fine. The taste was sweet, a little off, but still satisfying. You drank it at birthday parties, poured it over crushed ice on hot afternoons, and shared it at family dinners when you could not swing the name brand stuff. RC was cheaper, easier to find in bulk, and often sold by the case in discount grocery stores. Some parents swore they liked it better. Most kids could not tell the difference. And in houses where every penny mattered, nobody was complaining. It was soda that did not make you feel broke. It was celebration in a can, even if the label said otherwise. It let families feel like they had what everyone else had, just without the big-name price. It was a treat, a soda night reward, a way to feel like you had something extra even when the fridge was bare. RC Cola was not about prestige. It was about possibility, and it earned its spot in every low-budget grocery haul with fizz, sweetness, and just enough kick to get you through. It came in a tiny cardboard box with 2 foil packets inside, and somehow it stretched into enough food to feed the whole family. Lipton's soup mix was not just soup. It was casserole flavoring, dip base, meatloaf binder, and magic dust in poor homes during the 1970s. The onion flavor was the workhorse. You mixed it into sour cream to make a dip, stirred it into hamburger for extra taste, poured it into boiling water, and hoped the noodles made it hearty enough for a main dish. It was the secret to making bland food taste like something. It hid the flavor of old meat. It made cheap rice feel like dinner. It turned 2 ingredients into 5. It kept you from feeling like you were just eating to survive. It was cheap, versatile, and dependable. You did not buy it to impress anyone. You bought it because you needed dinner on the table fast and had about 2 ingredients to work with. Lipton soup mix helped meals feel like meals. It was not glamorous, but it gave flavor, made leftovers better, and helped plain ingredients feel complete. It was a pantry staple with no frills, just solutions. And when you were counting every cent, that was exactly what you needed. The bag was thin, the slices were soft and stuck together, and if you bought Kroger brand white bread in the 1970s, it was because it was the cheapest loaf on the shelf. No seeds, No whole grain, no attitude, just plain white bread that got the job done. You made peanut butter sandwiches with it, bologna, grilled cheese, French toast if you had eggs, bread pudding if it went stale. You toasted it, you buttered it, you packed it in lunchboxes 5 days a week. It was the loaf that never judged. It made the lunch table feel normal when the rest of your life didn't. It folded up for sandwiches without plates. It tasted like home even when there was nothing in the fridge. It was plain, but it held your whole day together. It tore easy, got soggy quick. But it was cheap and filled bellies. You could get 2 loaves for the price of 1 name brand, and in homes where pennies mattered, that meant everything. It was not something you savored. It was something you leaned on, something that showed up at every meal, held everything together, and asked for nothing in return. Kroger bread was not about flavor, it was about function, and sometimes that was all that mattered. They came in tiny cans packed in salty brine, soft little meat logs that looked like they belonged in a cartoon but tasted like a paycheck's last gasp. Hormel Vienna sausages were cheap, protein-packed, and weirdly satisfying when there was not much else in the cupboard. You ate them cold with saltines, fried them in a skillet, chopped them into rice or macaroni. They were mushy, a little greasy, and always just enough. They were meat that didn't need a freezer. They filled a sandwich when you had no lunch meat left. They smelled strange but reminded you of dinners at Grandma's. They were the kind of food you did not love, but you relied on. They were survival in a pop-top can. Kids loved them or hated them. There was no in-between. But parents bought them because they were affordable, did not spoil, and filled you up fast. 1 can could make 2 sandwiches if you were careful. And in a house where meals had to be stretched thin, that mattered more than taste. Hormel Vienna sausages were a last resort for some, a go-to for others. And for families getting by on food stamps and careful planning, they were a little tin of relief. It came in a foil-wrapped block that never spoiled and melted into pure gold. Velveeta cheese was not like other cheese, and that was the point. For poor families in the 1970s, it was the one product that made you feel like you were cooking something real, even if dinner started with a box or a can. You cubed it into macaroni, stirred it into rice, melted it for nachos, mixed it into scrambled eggs. It was smooth, creamy, and easy to use, even for a kid learning to cook. It made you feel like a real cook, even when you barely had anything to cook. It turned powdered mashed potatoes into comfort food. It brought kids to the table without anyone complaining. It made leftovers exciting. And it let you pretend for just a second that you had more than enough. Velveeta made casseroles stretch. It made leftovers exciting. It made anything feel like comfort food, even when the rest of the meal was bare bones. It was not sharp, it was not fancy, but it worked. And when you needed something that melted fast and tasted like more than it cost, Velveeta was there, sitting quietly in the fridge, waiting to help. It was cheese that fit the budget, and sometimes that was the only kind that mattered. It sat on the bottom shelf, wrapped in plain plastic with a no-frills logo, and if your family was poor in the 1970s, it was what you reached for every time. Western family toilet paper was thin, scratchy, and barely rolled straight, but it was cheap, and that was enough. You bought it in bulk. You used it sparingly. You stacked it in closets, kept it in the glove compartment, and never let the last roll run out. It was not something you talked about, but you noticed when it was gone. It lasted just long enough to get through the week. You folded it instead of crumpling it to make it go further. You knew the feel of it without looking, and you silently thanked it for just being there when it mattered. It was not soft, it was not strong, but it was toilet paper. And in households where the budget was tight, sometimes that was a luxury all its own. No one talked about it, but everyone used it. It was a quiet necessity, wrapped in a label that promised value instead of comfort. Western family toilet paper was not about quality. It was about making sure your home had the basics, whether they were pleasant or not. It came in a cardboard box filled with slim, dusty packets, each one promising breakfast in under 2 minutes. Quaker instant oatmeal was one of those things that showed up in every low-income kitchen in the 1970s, not because it was anyone's favorite, but because it was quick, filling, and just enough. You tore open the packet, poured it into a bowl, added hot water, and stirred. Sometimes it thickened too much. Sometimes it was runny, but you ate it anyway. The flavors were barely there: maple and brown sugar, apples and cinnamon, peaches and cream. Mostly it was sugar, flakes, and memory. It felt warm, even if it was thin. It felt like something real, even if it came out of a packet. For moms rushing to get kids to school or kids fending for themselves before the bus, it was a lifesaver. Some households stretched one packet across 2 kids. Others added extra oats to make it go further. And every now and then, if you were lucky, you would find a box with a variety pack. Something about the illusion of choice made it taste better. Quaker instant oatmeal was not glamorous. It was not hearty. But it was breakfast. It was the kind of food that got you through, gave you a little energy, and helped start the day with something more than an empty stomach. In homes where the food had to be fast and the money had to last, those little paper packets meant more than they looked. They looked like Oreos, kind of. But anyone who grew up poor in the 1970s knows they did not taste the same. Hydrox cookies were the generic version of a name-brand dream. The chocolate wafers were crisp, but just a little off. The filling was there, but not as creamy, not as sweet. And yet, for a lot of families, it was the only cookie that ever made it into the cart. Hydrox was what you bought when you wanted a treat but needed to stretch the grocery budget. You dipped them in milk, packed them in lunches, handed them out when friends came over. Some kids loved them. Some kids just ate them because there was nothing else. They did not come with ads. They did not come with prizes. They came in a quiet package that promised value, not flair. But they were always enough to stop a sugar craving in its tracks. You could find them in the pantry next to the store-brand cereal, wrapped in cellophane that crinkled the same way every time. Parents kept them on hand for dessert, for snacks, for those nights when there was no real dessert but you needed something sweet anyway. Hydrox were not the cookies you bragged about, but they were the ones you had. And for a lot of kids growing up without much, they became the flavor of Friday nights, after-school snacks, and the quiet reward for making it through another day. They were not Oreos. They were something else, something real. It started with a flash of light and a voice over the loudspeaker. "Attention Kmart shoppers." And just like that, the crowd moved. Kmart's blue light specials were not just discounts, they were events. For poor families in the 1970s, they were also the only way you ever got something new, or something extra. You never really planned to catch one. You just hoped you were there at the right time. One minute you were walking past socks and Tupperware, and the next minute you were part of a stampede around a flashing cart in the middle of the aisle. Clothes, toys, kitchen gadgets, it could be anything. The magic was in the mystery. You never knew what would be marked down, but you knew if you acted fast enough, you might walk away with something you could otherwise never afford. A new shirt, a toy for Christmas, a set of mixing bowls that would last you 10 years. Kids got excited. Parents held their breath at the register. And for a few minutes, that blue light made you feel like you had gotten lucky. Like you had scored a win in a week of budgeting and scraping by. Blue light specials were chaotic, messy, and unforgettable. They gave people who had very little a reason to smile, a reason to spend $5 on something just for once. And when you caught one, it felt like it was meant for you. In a time when money was tight, those quick flashes of blue felt like hope. It came in a plain metal tin with an old-fashioned logo and a stubborn lid that never quite sealed. Clabber Girl baking powder was a quiet fixture in 1970s kitchens, especially in households where every meal had to be made from scratch. If you were poor, you could not afford pre-made this or pre-mix that. But with a bag of flour, some lard or oil, and Clabber Girl, you could bake just about anything. Biscuits, pancakes, cornbread, dumplings. Clabber Girl was the unseen helper that made the rise happen. That made the crust a little fluffier, the edges a little lighter. It had no real flavor. It just worked. And when you were feeding 6 people on one paycheck, Something that worked was worth more than anything. You scooped it with a bent spoon. You measured it by memory. You passed it down from mother to daughter like it was tradition. There were no tricks, no marketing gimmicks, just a can that did its job week after week. If you baked your own bread because you could not afford the store version, Clabber Girl was there. If you mixed up pancake batter on Sunday mornings with powdered milk and rationed eggs, Clabber Girl was there. It never made the front of the recipe card, but it was always in the ingredients. In homes where the oven was a lifeline and a bag of flour had to stretch, Clabber Girl was the brand you counted on without even thinking about it. They sat on the bottom shelf in the canned food aisle, small, strange, and usually ignored by anyone who did not know what they were. But for poor families, especially those tied to church pantries or Seventh-day Adventist communities, Loma Linda soy meat cans were protein without the price tag of beef. The labels read things like vegetarian burger or fried chick in blocky font. The insides? A beige, spongy blend that looked like mystery meat and smelled just enough like real food to give it a shot. You opened it with hesitation. You dumped it into a pan with hope. And somehow, with the right seasoning, the right sauce, and enough hunger, it worked. It went into casseroles, sloppy Joe mix, or chili. You mashed it with breadcrumbs and eggs. You stirred it into rice or stretched it into sandwiches. It was not meat, and nobody thought it was. But it was filling. It was shelf-stable. It was cheap. For some families, especially those with dietary restrictions or small-town roots, Loma Linda was what you grew up on. You got used to the texture. You made it work. And you thanked God there was something, anything on the shelf when your options were thin. Loma Linda soy meat cans were not celebrated. They were tolerated. And in the hardest moments, that was more than enough. It was not about loving the food. It was about having food at all. In the 1980s, bringing your own lunch to school meant one thing. You had an Aladdin thermos. It was not just a container, it was a badge of honor. You opened your metal lunchbox, flipped that tiny red cup off the top of your thermos, and suddenly you were the main character of lunchtime. Aladdin made everything from licensed cartoon lunchboxes to vacuum-sealed beverage flasks that could survive a drop from a locker. Kids had Scooby-Doo, Star Wars, Care Bears, and every other pop culture icon plastered across their sandwich keepers. Parents loved them too, durable, affordable, and just commercial enough to keep the kids happy. But then came the slow fade. School cafeterias began offering more hot lunch options. Plastic containers with built-in ice packs started replacing metal boxes. Brands like Rubbermaid and Thermos rolled out slicker, modular designs. Aladdin tried to keep up, but their identity was too tied to a specific era. The metal designs felt bulky. The licensed characters got more expensive to maintain. And suddenly, the thermos that made you cool looked kind of dated. Aladdin still exists in some form, mostly through generic travel mugs and water bottles. But the magic is gone. For kids of the 1980s, Aladdin was part of a morning ritual, packed with care and excitement. Now it is mostly found in antique stores and memory boxes. Reminder of peanut butter sandwiches, thermos soup, and a time when lunch came with a little more personality. The bag of glass toy kit was one of those ideas that sounds like a joke, because it kind of was, but somehow ended up on actual store shelves. Inspired by a sketch from a comedy show, it became a bizarre reality thanks to novelty companies that took the joke way too far. Inside the package? A small clear bag filled with sharp-edged plastic shards that looked, and in some cases felt, a whole lot like real broken glass. Some versions were labeled as safe plastic, but others? Not so much. The idea was that kids could pretend to play with shattered glass as a prank or just for laughs. But what could possibly go wrong, right? Tiny cuts, choking hazards, or just the sheer confusion of teaching kids that handling jagged shards was entertainment. Parents were either horrified or totally unfazed, depending on their sense of humor. The product didn't last long, and while this prank kit was short-lived, plenty of long-term household items were just as risky, like hair dryers with zero insulation and a plug that sparked like a lightning bolt near the sink. Datsun was everywhere in the 1970s. Sleek, reliable, affordable. The kind of car your neighbor drove, your cousin saved up for, and your dad secretly liked better than his American sedan. It was Japan's Trojan horse into the United States market, and it worked brilliantly. But success brought identity problems. Nissan, its parent company, wanted global consistency. They did not want to be Datsun in one country and Nissan in another. So in the early 1980s, the decision was made: rebrand. Slowly, Datsun vanished. The name was pulled from brochures, badges, and showrooms. And just like that, a brand that millions had trusted was gone. People were confused. Dealerships had to explain that Nissan and Datsun were the same. Some buyers walked away. The transition was rocky, and for a while, Nissan lost ground in the market it had fought so hard to win. Looking back, the choice makes sense. But it still feels like something was stolen. A name, a memory, a piece of the road. Parker's is the second oldest name on this list by far. I mean, compared to the rest of the names on here, this is certifiably ancient. It was made in 1855 inside the Omni Parker House Hotel in Boston, which on its own is a pretty recognizable part of American history. It's one of America's oldest operating hotel restaurants, and the fact that it survived literally a century and more to tell its tale should let you know how successful this place really was. It was even the birthplace of some iconic regional foods, like the Boston cream pie, which was a deliciously rich pie with a unique cream filling you couldn't get anywhere else. To top that off, it had its own dish with its namesake that caught the wallets and eyes of people everywhere, which was the Parker House roll. It became extremely beloved in New England, becoming a huge part of the cuisine there, and even presidents were known to have visited the Omni Parker House Hotel just for a taste of Parker's restaurant. It blended in American menu items with French influences, something that, at the time, nobody else was doing. It makes sense that presidents visited this place, since a lot of them, like Charles Dickens and John F. Kennedy, who were regular patrons, were big fans of French cuisine too. At some point, someone decided mirrors did not belong on just the walls of dance studios. They belonged in your living room too. Mirrored walls were supposed to open up small spaces and reflect natural light. What they actually did was double your clutter, amplify fingerprints, and make your guests deeply uncomfortable. People would walk past their own reflections during dinner, trying not to make eye contact with themselves. The idea was chic. The reality was cold, clinical, and impossible to keep clean. What was meant to make your room look bigger ended up making it look busier, messier, and 10 times more high maintenance. And once one mirror cracked or peeled, the illusion of glamour shattered instantly. Every smudge, every streak, every greasy fingerprint stood out like graffiti. If you tried to hang art on them, you ended up with a framing nightmare. And if one cracked, it did not just ruin the wall, it shattered the illusion entirely. Mirrored walls were the visual equivalent of trying too hard, and as it turns out, they were not even the most fragile design feature of the decade. That title belonged to something hiding right above your head. Shakey's Pizza Parlor was a party with a crust. It was not just about the food. It was about the vibe. Communal tables, player pianos, arcade games, and pitchers of root beer big enough to share with the whole baseball team. It was the kind of place where you celebrated little league wins or just blew off steam with family. In the 1980s, Shakey's had a footprint that spanned the country. They were early pioneers in the idea that dining could be entertainment. But as the 90s approached, everything changed. Pizza Hut and Domino's embraced delivery. Kids wanted gaming consoles, not clunky arcades, and families wanted quicker, cheaper meals without all the noise. Shakey's tried to adapt, but the charm wore thin. Locations started closing. The ones that remained felt trapped in time. And not in the cool, nostalgic way. Just dated. The brand lives on in small pockets, especially overseas. But for most Americans, it disappeared quietly. All that is left is the memory of paper cups, thick crust, and a place that felt like your own little pizza carnival. Now, it is mostly just a name that makes people say, "Oh wow, I haven't thought about that in years." Television antennas in the 1960s were a test of both engineering skill and sheer audacity. You'd climb up on the roof with a giant metal rod, twist it until the static cleared, and shout down to someone inside for feedback. A little to the left. No, now it's worse. Back the other way. It was like guiding a spaceship with zero safety precautions. Most of these antennas weren't grounded properly. That meant if lightning struck, and it did, it would travel straight through the antenna, down the roof, and into your home. More than one dad became an unexpected conductor trying to adjust the Sunday game signal mid-storm. Even without lightning, a fall from the roof was a very real danger. These weren't lightweight aluminum poles. They were heavy, sharp-edged contraptions bolted to chimneys or mounted precariously with hopes and prayers. Some families installed them with rope and ladders. Others just sent up the most agile family member. Signal boosts meant the difference between watching your favorite show and enduring snow-filled fuzz, so the risk seemed worth it. But what started as a harmless adjustment often turned into a near-death experience. And if you think the antenna was risky, just wait until you remember the glue that smelled so strong it knocked kids out before the models were even finished. Before it made video game history, Coleco was just trying to survive. The Connecticut Leather Company, yes, that is what Coleco stood for, started with shoes and evolved into above-ground pools, plastic toys, and electronic gadgets. In the 1970s, it was everywhere, but it was never dominant, always chasing trends. Then came the video game boom. ColecoVision arrived and gave the company its first real taste of national success. The graphics were better. The games felt fresh. For a brief moment in the early 1980s, Coleco looked unstoppable. It felt like they had finally found their niche, a lane where they could lead instead of follow. But success came faster than the company could stabilize, but it did not last. The video game crash of 1983 hit like a hammer. Coleco overextended, banking on a market that evaporated almost overnight. It tried to pivot again, launching the Cabbage Patch Kids dolls, which sold in the millions. But lightning rarely strikes twice. Manufacturing problems, patent lawsuits, financial strain. By the end of the decade, Coleco was bankrupt, sold off, dismantled, and the dreams of a plastic empire turned to dust. For anyone who grew up in that era, Coleco was part of the magic, part of the joy, part of the fall. Right out of the humble neighborhoods of the Midwest, specifically Mankato, Minnesota, Happy Chef, which first debuted in 1963, became known for its classic American diner fare, which included a lot of recognizable breakfast dishes and burgers. It also took some notes out of McDonald's playbook, as each location had this really eye-catching statue of the restaurant's mascot, which was a smiling, happy chef. The statue would be holding a spoon and a menu board, and some of those statues even spoke to customers, making it really popular with children. At its peak, it was around 60 locations strong, and those were more or less primarily in Minnesota and the neighboring states, but what it aimed to do, it did well. It had a regional grip that competitors couldn't shake off, and that gave a lot of other restaurants down the road the idea of having strong fan bases with your local regional communities rather than trying to capture a nationwide audience. Zayre was your go-to store when you needed something quick, cheap, and in style, at least for a while. With its wide aisles and even wider sales, it felt like the kind of place that always had what you needed, even if you did not know what that was. Kids' clothes, home goods, a new cassette deck. It was all there. Zayre thrived in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It understood the American shopper's desire for convenience without breaking the bank. But competition was growing. Target was sleeker. Kmart was faster. And Walmart was, everywhere. Zayre struggled to define itself in this new retail landscape. Its stores started to feel tired. The deals were not as exciting. The branding got fuzzy. Shoppers noticed. The decline was not sudden, but it was steady. By the end of the 1980s, Zayre began selling off locations and assets. Eventually, it folded into other chains, and the name disappeared. Another once familiar sign taken down, replaced by something newer and shinier. But for those who grew up with it, Zayre was more than just a store. It was part of their weekly routine. Now it is just a piece of shopping history. Clackers were 2 acrylic or glass balls tied to a string and handed to children with no safety warnings and a full green light. You'd hold the middle of the string, swing the balls upward and downward until they collided above and below your hand, producing that iconic clack-clack sound. It looked simple. It sounded addictive. It was also a hazard waiting to happen. The plastic versions could chip. The glass ones could shatter. And if you missed your rhythm, one ball went rogue, swinging at eyebrow height with all the grace of a wrecking ball. Kids practiced for hours, trying to get the timing right, turning every playground into a percussion concert of risk. Parents shrugged. Teachers banned them. Hospitals stocked up on ice packs and gauze. But still, they were cool. Until one clack too many ended in sharp pieces flying through the air. Eventually, safety commissions pulled them off shelves. But back then, one broken pair just meant you were in the market for another. And if that seemed dangerous, wait till you hear about people putting flammable foam containers directly onto gas stoves like it was just another Tuesday. In the late 1970s, Vidal Sassoon was more than a brand. It was a movement. The salons, the products, the commercials. If you do not look good, we do not look good. It was bold, sharp, and full of promise. The Vidal Sassoon salons offered high-end haircuts with a modern edge. Women felt transformed. Men took notice. It was more than a trim. It was a lifestyle. You were not just getting a haircut. You were getting modernized, elevated, made new. For many, it was the first time they felt stylish instead of simply presentable. But like many trends, it struggled to evolve. The early 1980s brought new fashion rules, big hair, wild volume. Sassoon's geometric precision began to feel too rigid, too old. Franchises thinned. The elite vibe became a burden, not a benefit. Meanwhile, cheaper salons, home styling kits, and new celebrity stylists flooded the market. The salons faded. The products moved to drugstore shelves. And the name that once meant sophistication became just another bottle in the aisle. But there was a time, brief, electric, when getting your hair done at Vidal Sassoon felt like stepping into the future. And losing that future stung more than people admit. In 1861, Shafts was a really common and beloved name in the American food industry, and it was known as the perfect confectionery chain to go to for a good ice cream sundae. It was founded by William Shraft, who specialized in candy production before the guy decided to try his luck at being a restaurateur, and that was a stint that started in the early 1900s. It was known for being upscale, feeling a bit more prestigious than other places, but still being affordable enough for the audience it wanted to capture. The classic American menu of Shraft's appealed to women more than families, and it offered an ambiance that was built for them in 2 ways. One, it featured a lot of recipes they'd make at home, which meant that they could enjoy a taste of their own medicine for once without working for it. 2, since it did feature things like chicken pot pies and clam chowder, if the wife ever felt sick and couldn't make food that day, because that does happen, they had a reliable go-to option in Shraft. They could just order a chicken pot pie from there and be done with dinner plans for the day, which was a really big help in that era. The elegant interiors, the white tablecloths, the uniformed staff, all of it gave the impression of, yeah, this place is legitimate. Though it didn't have a presence as big as hundreds of locations nationwide, the dozens that it did were all well known and beloved throughout the East Coast. Unfortunately, trends would go towards the fast food business model, and that was what would end up being the final nail in Shraft's coffin, even if it did put up a pretty good fight. If your eyes ever hurt walking into a 1970s kitchen, the culprit was probably the floor. Vinyl flooring in that era came in every wild pattern imaginable. Psychedelic swirls, checkerboard grids, paisley overlays that looked like melted wallpaper. It was meant to be durable, stylish, and easy to clean. In reality, it cracked, peeled, and clashed with every furniture update you attempted. Over time, the colors faded to an uncertain gray or yellowed from the sun. Families tried to cover them with throw rugs, but the damage was already done. The designs did not age gracefully. They just became harder to ignore. What was once considered expressive quickly felt chaotic and cheap. And yet, it was impossible to walk through a suburban home without seeing those dizzying tiles in at least one room. It was design overload from the ground up. But if you think that was bad, wait until you see what we were proudly hanging on our walls. In the history of Silicon Valley, few names are more foundational than Fairchild Semiconductor. They were not just a company, they were the spark that lit the modern tech industry. Formed in the 1950s, Fairchild was where the microchip was born. By the time the 1980s rolled in, they were a household name in tech circles. Their circuits powered everything from early computers to space technology. It was the place where innovation lived. But innovation has a price, especially when the people doing the inventing get restless. Fairchild's top minds, known as the Traitorous Eight, eventually left to start companies like Intel. That brain drain never really stopped. Fairchild kept making good hardware, but their leadership was slow to adapt. They missed key opportunities in consumer tech and failed to compete in a marketplace that was evolving faster than ever. While rivals streamlined production and dove into personal computing, Fairchild stayed tied to older business models and corporate red tape. The tech they pioneered was now being perfected by others. Profits slipped. Acquisitions followed. Fairchild was eventually absorbed and reabsorbed until the name barely meant anything at all. Today, you will find references to them in documentaries and textbooks, but not on product shelves. They helped invent the future, but somehow they were not part of it. And that might be the most bittersweet kind of legacy. Candy cigarettes were a sugar-coated pipeline to adult bad habits. They came in little cardboard boxes that looked exactly like the real thing, filtered, flip-top, even with red tips to mimic a burning end. You'd pull one out, tap it against your hand like you'd seen in movies, and blow out a puff of cornstarch smoke that made you feel like the coolest kid on the block. They were sweet, chalky, and totally addictive, in flavor and in fantasy. For kids, they weren't just candy. They were props. You could strut around pretending to light up with confidence, then crunch it down in a few bites. Parents mostly shrugged. After all, it was just sugar, right? But looking back, these treats weren't as innocent as they seemed. The candy industry leaned into the trend with flashy packaging and even cartoon mascots, as if every 7-year-old needed their own pack of pretend smokes. But while candy cigarettes were bad enough, things got even more blatant once actual cigarette brands wormed their way into children's programming with smooth voices, catchy jingles, and cartoon cowboys who sold more than just action. Geno's Hamburgers was a mid-Atlantic icon. With its bold red signs and sports tie-ins, it stood out in a crowded fast food landscape. Kids loved the burgers, adults loved the prices, and everybody loved the connection to football legend Gino Marchetti, who co-founded the chain after retiring from the NFL. It was fast, friendly, and local. In cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, it was as common as traffic. But Geno's had ambitions beyond the region. It wanted to go national. What felt like a hometown treasure did not always translate outside the neighborhood. The farther it spread, the more it lost the charm that made it matter. The problem was the rest of the country already had their go-to burger joints: McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's. Geno's tried to differentiate. It added Kentucky Fried Chicken to its menu through a partnership. It redesigned stores. But growth was slow. The charm that worked in Baltimore did not translate in California. By the 1980s, Marriott had bought the chain and converted most of the locations into Roy Rogers. Just like that, Geno's was gone. The buildings changed, the signs came down, and a local legend faded into memory. But for those who grew up with it, Geno's was never just a burger. It was home. Joe's Stone Crab was situated in the busy heart of Miami Beach, Florida, and it was made by a man called Joe Weiss. What began as a humble seafood shack that was known for a pretty decent sandwich expanded into one of the biggest tourist spots of Florida in general during the 1913s. How? Well, while Stone Crab had a pretty good sandwich, it needed a bit more of a kick to get itself going, and it did that when it found the Florida Stone Crab, which was both the restaurant's namesake and its most widely demanded item. It was served cold with a mustard sauce, and it attracted foodies from every nook and cranny of America. It was also popular for being one of the few seafood places that served more than a sandwich and also didn't have any reservations policies, but the wait times were long. They also had steak options if you didn't like seafood but wanted to take the family, so they had most bases covered. They pioneered stone crab as a dish, which is now an extremely popular menu item all over America. The promise of modular furniture was simple: flexibility, creativity, and smart design for small spaces. What we got instead was a collection of flimsy particle board pieces that wobbled with every move. These were the stackable shelves, folding tables, and interchangeable couch systems that dominated catalogs in the 1970s. And on paper, they made sense. Custom configurations, easy to rearrange, and light enough to move around by yourself. But there was a reason they were light. They were also fragile. The locking mechanisms broke, the cheap finishes peeled, and what looked cool in the store rarely held up under the daily wear of real life. Coffee tables would sag in the middle, bookshelves leaned like tired soldiers. Even the stylish-looking modular couches were uncomfortable and awkward to clean. Some homeowners embraced the idea at first, charmed by the sense of innovation. But over time, the frustration set in. The dream of flexible living turned into a house full of disposable furniture. And if the modular design failed to impress, the next status symbol at least came with its own built-in glamour, until nobody wanted it anymore. Intellivision had ambition. Released by Mattel in the early 1980s, it was not just a gaming console, it was a challenge to Atari. With better graphics, a full numeric controller, and a library of games that felt just a little smarter, Intellivision made a strong first impression. For a moment, it looked like it could win. The advertising war was fierce. They even ran ads comparing their system directly to Atari's, pointing out every technical shortcoming. But then came the crash. In 1983, the video game market collapsed. Oversaturation, poor quality control, and waning interest left the industry in shambles. Mattel, unprepared for the downturn, slashed the division. Intellivision faded, even as competitors like Nintendo emerged from the wreckage with a new vision. For those who had one, Intellivision felt like a secret club, something a little different, a little more thoughtful. Now it is mostly remembered in retrospectives and collector forums, another what could have been buried under layers of silicon and nostalgia. Aurora slot cars were a must-have for every young speedster in the 1960s. The bright colors, snappy bodies, and twisting plastic tracks brought the thrill of racing right into the basement. You'd plug in the controller, slam the trigger, and watch your tiny car whip around the corners like it was chasing the Indy 500. But that thrill came with some unintended side effects. The motors inside those early models ran hot. Too hot. After a few laps, some would overheat and melt the chassis, leaving a smoking puddle where your prized vehicle once sat. Others sparked at random, shooting little arcs of electricity that looked cool, until they scorched your hand. And since the cars were often left plugged in for hours, the plastic casings warped, cracked, or fused with the tracks. Some even caught fire. Parents started noticing the smell first, that sharp, burnt plastic scent that lingered like a warning. Eventually, complaints piled up and multiple models were recalled. But for kids, those slot cars were irresistible. Speed came first, safety came second, or not at all. And if melting race cars weren't shocking enough, just wait until you remember what dads used to do on the roof with a metal rod during a thunderstorm. Woolco was supposed to be the next evolution of Woolworths. It had the size of a department store and the soul of a five and dime. Launched in the 1960s and booming into the 1970s, Woolco promised everything in one place: clothes, toys, appliances, groceries. For families used to making a dozen different stops, it felt like magic. A bright red sign that said you could get it all without going broke. But behind that promise was chaos. Poor inventory systems, outdated layouts, stores too big to manage and too cluttered to navigate. And then came the competition. Kmart, Target, Walmart. Retail giants with cleaner shelves, sharper prices, and better supply chains. Woolco could not keep up. It became the store you only visited when you had to, the store where the lights buzzed too loud and the shelves were always half empty. By the 1980s, most Woolcos had either been shut down or sold off. Some were turned into malls, others just disappeared, and with them went a small piece of how we used to shop, wandering the aisles on Saturday mornings, dreaming about toys, picking out socks with Mom. Woolco was not perfect, but it was familiar, and we miss it more than we admit. Lewis's Lunch in New Haven, Connecticut, was opened after the days of Antoine and Parker's findings, though it was still around when they were kicking. First touching American soil in 1895, this restaurant is special, even among this list of industry pioneers and innovators. Why is that so? Because, well, if a hamburger has helped you at any point in your life, and I know it's saved me on the worst days of mine, then we both have Lewis's Lunch to thank. The legend goes like this. The founder, Louis Lasson, made the first ever American hamburger when he had to put ground beef between two slices of bread to serve a customer in a big rush. And this caught on so well that it became the format for just about the next 2 centuries for American eating. I mean, I'm sure we'll still be eating hamburgers well into 2095. The simplicity of Louis' Lunch makes it a knockout with its loyal fan base, who know what they come for and pay to get and are perfectly content with the formula. A very, if it isn't broke, don't fix it kind of approach, but one that's worked well. Keeping ties strong with the loyal customer base you've built is as legitimate a strategy as expanding menus and trying out new experimental foods. And Louis' White Toast and Only Cheese hamburgers are an American classic that will never leave the history books. If any of these old-school brands brought back a memory or reminded you just how much a little had to do, share your story in the comments. Tap like if any of it felt familiar, and hit subscribe so we can keep honoring the grit behind every grocery list.